Subways are often seen as just a way to get from point A to point B, but when the city's underground tunnels empty out at night, they become a breeding ground for unsettling encounters. In this series, we dive into 3 chilling real-life stories of people who found themselves face to face with something far more dangerous than they expected while riding the subway. Hold on tight, because these are the kinds of experiences you'd never want to encounter alone in the dark. I was 24 years old and new to New York City. It was my first time living alone, and I was still learning the rhythms of the city. The constant noise, the rush of people, and the strange tension that came with public spaces like the subway. Most nights, the trains were crowded, and I felt safe in the anonymity of the masses. But that Friday night was different. I'd stayed late at work, finishing a project my boss wanted first thing Monday. By the time I reached the station, it was past midnight. The platform was almost empty, just a few stragglers here and there. I wasn't worried. This was New York after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against a column near the far end of the platform, his hoodie pulled up over his head. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just scrolling through his phone. Still, something about him set me on edge. Maybe it was the way his body angled slightly toward me, or the fact that he hadn't boarded the last train that stopped, even though the platform was nearly deserted. The next train pulled in, and I stepped into the nearest car. I quickly took a seat and glanced out the window, scanning the platform to see if he'd gotten on. At first, I didn't see him, and I let out a small breath of relief. But as the doors started to close, he stepped onto the train, his eyes locking with mine as he entered the car. I felt a chill creep up my spine. He sat 2 rows behind me, not directly across, not too close, but just close enough that I couldn't ignore him. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just another late-night commuter heading home. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll, keeping him in my peripheral vision. The train lurched forward, and I decided to test a theory. At the next stop, I stood and moved to another car, casually, as if I'd simply gotten bored of my seat. I slipped through the connecting doors and found a seat in the next car. A few minutes later, I glanced back. He had followed me. He was standing near the doors, pretending to look at the subway map, but his eyes weren't on the map. They were on me. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. This man was following me. I didn't want to panic, but my mind raced with possibilities. Was he a pickpocket, waiting for the right moment? Or something worse? I clutched my bag tighter and scanned the car for other passengers. There were a few, a middle-aged couple chatting quietly and a man dozing near the corner. But none of them seemed aware of the tension building between me and the stranger. At the next stop, I made a decision. As soon as the doors opened, I stepped out, making a sharp turn toward the exit. My plan was to leave the station and find a bodega or someplace safe to wait for a cab. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate, and too close for comfort. I didn't dare look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the street level, scanning for any sign of help. The area was quiet, just a row of shuttered storefronts and dim streetlights. My pulse raced as the footsteps grew louder. I spotted a 24-hour convenience store across the street and bolted toward it, my shoes slapping against the pavement. I threw open the door and practically collapsed onto the counter, gasping for breath. The cashier, a bored-looking guy in his 20s, raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" I turned, expecting to see the man right behind me, but the street outside was empty. No sign of him. I felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. Had he given up? Or was he just waiting for me to let my guard down? I stayed in the store for almost an hour, pretending to browse and buying things I didn't need. Finally, I called a cab and had it take me home, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering what his intentions had been. Was he just a thief, or had I narrowly escaped something far worse? I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain. I'll never take an empty subway car for granted again. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't my first late ride on the subway, but it was definitely my most unsettling. I'd been working late at a marketing firm in the city, burning the midnight oil on a presentation. It was a Friday, and most people had already gone home for the weekend. I remember how quiet the office had felt as I finished up, leaving me alone in the elevator on the way down. When I reached the subway station, it was already after midnight, the kind of time when the trains start to thin out and only the diehards remained. I stepped into the station and checked the schedule. There was a train arriving in 5 minutes, and no one else was around. Just the faint echo of my footsteps on the concrete. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a Friday night in New York, and the city felt alive even at this hour. But as I waited by the platform, something felt off. The train arrived, and I was the only one who got on. The car was empty, with only the low hum of the train filling the space. I chose a seat toward the middle of the car, as far from the doors as possible. There's something about sitting at the entrance of an empty subway car at night that just feels exposed, so I always preferred to sit in the middle. I had my headphones in, trying to unwind and forget about the stress of the day. I was just getting comfortable when the doors to the car suddenly slid open at the next stop. I didn't think much of it, figuring it was another commuter. But when I looked up, I saw him. A man in his mid-30s, dressed in a worn-out leather jacket and faded jeans, stepped in. His eyes flicked toward me briefly, but then he looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor as he shuffled toward a seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, but what struck me was how out of place he seemed. He wasn't wearing headphones, no backpack or briefcase, nothing that said he was just another commuter. He looked like he was just passing through, like he had no real destination. I glanced back at him as he sat across from me, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes never left the floor. His hands were clasped in his lap, and his head tilted slightly forward, as though he was in a trance. I shook off the unease. Maybe he was just tired or had a long day, but as the train moved through the tunnels, something started to feel off. The air in the car grew thick, heavier, like the quiet had been too long. He wasn't staring at me, but the feeling of his presence was so intense I couldn't shake it. I looked around the car to see if anyone else had gotten on, but there was no one else, just the two of us, alone in this hollow space beneath the city. The next stop came and I decided to get off. My stop wasn't far, and I figured I'd be better off on a bus or walking home than staying in the eerily quiet car with this man. As the train slowed, I stood up, heading toward the doors. That's when he moved. He stood up too, his footsteps a little too quick, a little too close. My pulse quickened. I was almost at the door when I heard him speak, his voice low and raspy. Leaving so soon? I froze. I hadn't expected him to say anything, and I didn't even know how he had gotten so close without me noticing. I didn't respond, just kept my eyes on the doors. I could feel his stare burning into my back, the weight of it making my skin crawl. The train jerked to a stop, and the doors opened. I stepped out, half expecting him to follow me. But he didn't. He stood in the doorway, just watching me, his hands still at his sides, his face expressionless. I didn't turn back. I sprinted up the stairs, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to get as far away as possible. When I hit street level, I was shaking, out of breath. looking around to see if he had followed. But there was nothing. The street was empty, as quiet as the subway car had been. I didn't take the subway for the next few days. I found myself taking longer routes home, avoiding the underground world entirely. And though I never saw him again, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Leaving so soon? I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed, but every time I take the subway now, I remember that night. I remember how the quiet of the train felt. Wrong. How his eyes never left me. How he moved so suddenly and too quickly. And most of all, I wonder if I was just another stop on his list of targets, or if I was lucky enough to slip away unnoticed. I was used to working late. I just started a new job at a tech startup in Chicago, and like most young professionals, I found myself buried in work, staying at the office long after most people had left. It had been a rough week, and by the time I finished up the project, it was well past 1 a.m. I had just missed the last bus, so I had no choice but to take the subway. The station was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few tired commuters huddled near the walls, waiting for their trains to show up. The usual hum of the city was absent, and the air felt heavy in the way that made my stomach turn. I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to shake off the creeping unease as I bought my ticket. As I waited by the platform, I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches. He was wearing a large coat, even though the weather wasn't that cold for a Chicago winter. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and he seemed to be staring off into the distance. The platform was deserted, aside from the two of us. The silence between us felt unnatural. I glanced around, hoping someone else would show up, but no one did. When the train finally pulled in, I didn't think much of it. I got on and sat near the door, as close to the exit as I could. The car was dimly lit, and I was the only one on board, just me and the empty space. The train jolted to life, and I let out a small sigh of relief, settling into my seat. That's when I saw him again. The man from the platform had boarded the train after me. He was standing near the middle, gripping the pole with one hand. I hadn't heard the doors open, hadn't heard a single sound that would have indicated he'd gotten on. The doors had simply closed behind me, and he was there. His eyes met mine for a brief second before he looked away. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept my gaze straight ahead, pretending to ignore him, but every few seconds, I could feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The train was almost completely silent, save for the occasional screech of the tracks. I watched the man's reflection in the window, trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible. He was still gripping the pole, but now his body was positioned in a way that made me uneasy. He wasn't just standing normally. He was angled toward me, his body slightly tilted, as though he was trying to make himself more visible in the reflection. At the next stop, I made my move. I stood up quickly and moved to the other side of the car, hoping to distance myself from him. I took a seat on the opposite side, facing away from him. I kept my eyes down, pretending to fiddle with my phone, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing up every now and then. And there he was, standing in the same spot, still facing me, still gripping the pole. His eyes were locked on mine again, and I could feel my heart begin to race. The train's motion felt sluggish, like it was dragging me into the depths of something darker and unknown. The next stop came and I hesitated. Something in me told me I shouldn't get off yet, but I didn't want to make a scene, and I wasn't sure if I was just imagining things. So I stayed on, convincing myself it was nothing. But then, as the doors were closing, I saw him move. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate, his footsteps almost soundless. I froze, my hand tight around my bag. I wanted to get off at the next stop, but something told me not to. Something told me I shouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd scared me. When he was only a few feet away from me, I finally stood up, ready to make a break for the door, but he didn't stop. He reached out, grabbing my shoulder, his grip tight and cold. "Where are you going?" he whispered. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. His breath was stale, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something unsettlingly familiar about his face, like I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place where. I didn't think, I just reacted. I yanked my shoulder free and rushed toward the doors, slamming my palm against the emergency stop button. The train screeched to a halt, and I jumped off at the next station, stumbling as I ran down the stairs to the street level. The cold air hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop running. I kept my head down, my hands trembling as I darted into the nearest 24-hour diner, locking the door behind me. I didn't know if he was still following me, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. So after that night, I couldn't take the subway without thinking of that man. Every time the doors closed behind me, every time I felt the train slow down, I wondered if I'd see him again. I never did, but I always wondered. And now, when I'm on the train at night, I never sit near the door. I always sit near the middle, far enough from anyone that I can make an exit if I need to, because I learned the hard way that in the subway, sometimes the real danger isn't the shadows. It's the people who lurk in plain sight.